Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to Ohelei Avotenu, Tents of Our Fathers. Today we are in Parshat Acharei Mot Kedoshim, and this is a very, very important passage as far as I'm concerned. Let me start by telling you a story. I heard this years ago, that once there was an English teacher who was explaining to his class that in English you can have a yes or a positive affirmation answer, and that is a positive. You can have a negative affirmation or negate a statement, and it's a negative. So yes is yes, no is no. And you can have a negative negative, right? So when you do a negative negative, you can turn it into a positive. So that's not right, right? So you can turn a negative into a positive by adding another negative. You're negating the negative. But you can't have a positive positive that turns into a negative in the English language. And somebody piped up from the back, yeah, right, you know. And one of the things that I learned over the years is that expressions and idioms and trying to understand the words as we read them, particularly in the Word of God, can be challenging, not least because we're unpacking His Word through layers of scholarship, layers of language and idiomatic use, contextual reading, and where does that start and stop? And you know, it's relevant today because people are wading again into debates that have been going on for thousands of years, and I don't presume that any one of us will be the fellow who ends the debate for all time, for all people, but approaching his word carefully is important. And I recently watched a video where an esteemed Torah teacher who is well known and respected by many, many people kept, pointing out something in the word as being, well, you got to look at the broader context. You got to look at the broader cultures. You got to look at all the surrounding nations. You got to understand what was happening in the cultures of the day. And while there is a certain amount of merit to that idea, understanding the ancient Near East helps to understand what was going on contextually. It also can do great harm to understanding, right? And that's why we have to proceed with caution. Now, what do I mean by great harm to understanding? Well, if you are looking at the ancient Israelites as merely an artifact of the ancient Near East, and that they're basically like everybody else, and that their culture is basically like everybody else, and that their laws are basically like everybody else, then you have a tension with the biblical text. The biblical text, God calls his people out as distinct and separate and holy, and calls us to be distinct and separate and holy. And this particular passage we have 3 times, and I'm going to read all 3 of them where this is called out, and I'm going to do so with purpose. So starting in Leviticus 18, 1 through 5, we read, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do what is done in the land of Egypt where you lived, nor are you to do what is done in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You are to perform my judgments and keep my statutes, to live in accord with them. I am the Lord your God. So you shall keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a person follows them, then he will live by them. I am the Lord. Right? So this is like the introductory to a list of laws that we're going to get into in terms of human sexuality, morality, and a few other things. Now, what's interesting, obviously, God never says anything that he doesn't mean. He says things with purpose. But it has been noted that when God repeats himself, much like a parent or whoever, there's an emphasis. And then when it's repeated repeatedly, that should really cause you to take note. So the second one we're going to read is kind of it. It almost reads as a bookend, but we're going to find out in a moment that it's not actually the bookend. It's more a middling. Leviticus 18, 24 through 19:2. Do not defile yourselves by any of these things, for by all these things the nations which I am driving out from you have become defiled. For the land has become defiled, therefore I have brought its punishment upon it. So the land has vomited out its inhabitants. But as for you, you are to keep my statutes and my judgments, and you shall not do any of these abominations, neither the native nor the stranger who resides among you. For the people of the land who were there before you did all these abominations, and the land has become defiled, so that the land will not vomit you out should you defile it, as it has vomited out the nation which was there before you. For whoever does any of these abominations, those persons who do so shall be cut off from among their people. So you are to keep your commitment to me, not to practice any of the abominable customs which have been practiced before you, so that you do not defile yourselves with them. I am the Lord your God. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. So again, he's saying, and it's pretty self-explanatory. This is my commentary. We are to be different, set apart. Our customs are not to be based off of the customs of the cultures we come from. They're not supposed to be based off of the cultures of the customs of the cultures of the lands in which we dwell. They are to come from him, right? It's not about the Egyptian Empire, the Amalekite Empire, the Canaanite Empire, the Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Greco-Romans, the Russians, the British Empire, the Germans. Right now we talk about American exceptionalism. No, God's culture is exceptional. We will never come up with a better system than his. And if you think that your system is better than his, well then, who died and made you God, right? Anyway, so fundamentally, this is the second time he's basically saying the same thing in the same passage. The third time, Leviticus 20, verses 22 through 26. Keep all my decrees and laws and follow them, so that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out. You must not live according to the customs of the nations I am going to drive out before you. Because they did all these things, I abhorred them. But I said to you, you will possess their land. I will give it to you as an inheritance, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has set you apart from the nations. You must therefore make a distinction between clean and unclean animals, and between unclean and clean birds. Do not defile yourselves by any animal or bird or anything that moves along the ground. Those that I have set apart as unclean for you, you are to be holy to me, because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. Now, why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because there's a trend in current scholarship that says that if there is an aspect of Torah culture that we just don't like, people have brought up biblical slavery, and I'm not talking about American slavery. Those are very different things. And student loans, let's leave that alone for today because we don't have time. Biblical slavery, war brides, polygyny, right? The practice of taking more than one wife. And people have tried to say, well, God didn't really want us to do those things, but because, just everybody in the ancient world did that stuff, he didn't somehow have the ability to tell his people that it's just simply not okay, right? So instead of forbidding those things, he had to just realize that, well, people were going to do it anyway. So he's got to give laws on how to do the thing, and eventually, when more enlightened cultures showed up that banned those things, eventually those cultures would save us from ourselves, and we would come to a more enlightened vision of God and God's laws, and the laws by which we should govern our societies. But the problem is that seems to stand in direct contradiction to this entire segment, where God starts, middles, and ends with saying, don't be like those other cultures, don't be like those other nations. And it's not only here, he does this elsewhere in the text. We're not supposed to think we're going to worship him the way that the nations do. So he starts, middles, and ends this way. And then he gives a list of all things that apparently the cultures in that area are doing, right? That he says this is, he is telling us that we are not allowed to do these things as his people. We're not allowed to do those things. So apparently, God is not deficient to tell his people, no, you can't do that, even if the other nations are doing those things, even if the Amalekites are abusing their sheep romantically. That doesn't mean you can, right? Even if people are marrying their father's wives, doesn't mean you can. If people are marrying their daughters-in-law, doesn't mean you can. So the idea that somehow God just couldn't tell his people, no, don't do that thing, because, well, it was just a thing in the surrounding culture. Everybody was doing it, peer pressure, whatever. It's it's a bad argument on its face, right? It's not internally consistent with God, who he is, his character, who he shows himself to be in this passage. He has no problem saying, you will not be like them. You will follow my laws, because you're my people and you're going to be holy as I am holy. And again, I'm paraphrasing. This is my commentary. I'm not making direct quotes, nor am I trying to put words into his mouth. But I find it to be a really bad argument, right? To say that God just couldn't tell his people not to do certain things because all the surrounding cultures did those things. It flies in the face of the very point of this passage. So if you're going to make your arguments, make your arguments. But I don't believe that, is a particularly good argument. And we can get into, when people further try to talk about the polygamy issue, specifically polygyny, a man taking more than one wife. They get into Leviticus 18:18, and they say, well, this is idiomatic. It says a woman and her sister, but it's not really talking about actual sisters. It's talking about any woman. You're like, all women are sisters, man, and they point to an expression when they're talking about joining the tent curtains of the tabernacle, about joining one to her sister. And then they say, well, so clearly this is idiomatic. And going back to, yeah, right. You can use, yeah, right, in a positive. You can say, if someone asks you, you're saying this, right? And you say, yeah, right. You know, you're affirming with a double affirmation that that is in fact what you're saying. There's no sarcasm in your voice. When you disagree with someone, yeah, right, man. You know, um, and further, when it comes to um, the expression, yeah, right. And if you have other variants on this, I would love to see it in the comments below. But when when I'm giving driving directions to my child who's learning how to drive, she's not a child anymore. She's a young woman. She's learning how to drive, and she's asking me whether we're making a left-hand turn. I've found that it is confusing for me to say right as an affirmation, or yeah, right as an affirmation. Why? Because right is also a direction. So when we're talking about turning, I usually try to remember to say, that's correct, or no, we're turning right. So rather than, she's in the left-hand lane, she wants to make a left-hand turn, and she says, we're going left, right? And I go, right. Am I affirming or am I contradicting? Yeah. So I have found that at times it's important to say left or correct, or if I disagree with her, no, let's turn to the right, and articulate a little more carefully what I'm talking about. The difficulty, in my very strong opinion, with presuming that that this is idiomatic speech is multi-layered. A, if it were an ancient Hebrew idiom, right, that was meant to prevent um, polygyny generally, then it would have been understood as an ancient Hebrew idiom by all the ancient Hebrew speakers. And yet, we don't see that this is interpreted this way by pretty much anyone in the biblical narratives. In fact, if you can find one example, a single solitary example of someone who interprets it this way, please let me know. Someone in the Bible to whom God commanded these things. David, any of them, right? Any of the ancient peoples, whether we're talking from the time of the giving of the Torah, Moses, all the way to the New Testament era, I don't see an example of anyone who took this particular stance, number one. Number two, God himself talks about having taken two sisters, Jerusalem, right, and Samaria, Judah and Israel, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, the Jews and the Ephraimites, if you want to call them that, or Aholah and Aholibah. And so he doesn't seem to take it that way. And then, of course, you get to Jacob. Was Jacob somehow in sin? Well, some people have presumed so, or they've said, well, the law was only given later, and we can have that discussion. But there's another aspect of the Hebrew that is often ignored, in my opinion. In Torah, we're not allowed to shave for the dead, right? But that doesn't mean we're not allowed to shave. Like, for example, cutting your hair off for the dead is one thing, but cutting your hair, if you take a Nazirite vow, that's a different thing, right? So sometimes there's a blanket prohibition on something, and sometimes there's a prohibition for cause. Why are you doing it? And the Hebrew says you're not supposed to do this litzor, um, for a rival. Now the question is, are you banned from doing it because it naturally creates that condition, or are you banned from doing it with that purpose in mind? And people have been debating that back and forth for a very long time. So none of the ancient people seemed to have taken this idiomatically. God doesn't seem to have taken this as a prohibition on himself in the way that a lot of people do. Jacob and those things, we can have those discussions. We can talk about the motive clause. But then there's also, let's assume that we are looking at the context of the immediate passage. And in the immediate passage, let's just assume that it's talking about biological sisters specifically and ignore the litzror clause. It would fit the context of forbidden relations with specific family members, right? Fathers, mothers, brother or daughter-in-law, those kinds of things. A woman and her daughter. So the immediate context is on relatives, right? So we can even have that discussion. And the last reason why I don't really think this is a particularly great argument is because the first time anybody came up with it is in the 50s or 60s or something like that. Maybe even as early back as the 1800s. I don't remember, or was it the 1980s? My dyslexia might be getting me there. But regardless, the first time an explicit link between this idea and polygamy general was made was relatively recent, right? And unfortunately, we people tend to justify our current cultures through his word rather than the other way around. And there was a time when people justified American slavery with biblical texts. There was a time when people justified the abolishment of American slavery with biblical texts. Some people promote capitalism, some people promote socialism, some people promote whatever, and they cherry pick their verses. And it's like, when you are starting from that frame of you're trying to justify your local cultural practices with cherry-picked passages and say, well, if it's not my culture, then we need to avoid that thing in the Bible. You're being backwards, and that's not exegesis, that's eisegesis. And for those of you who do not know what eisegesis is, it is not a Christophany, I see Jesus. That's not what we're talking about. Exegesis means you're taking meaning out of the text, right? What does it say? And you're drawing that from the text, and you then strive to apply it to your life accurately, humbly, and so on and so forth with the love of Messiah. Eisegesis is when you're reading things into the text, right? You're starting from your cultural frame of reference, and then you are trying to go around and make sense of the world that way. And unfortunately, your Egyptian culture frame of reference is not the one. Canaanite cultural reference is not the one. Amalekite cultural reference is not the one. Persian, Babylonian, Greek, Roman, British, Russian, German, American, Canadian, whatever. That's not the one. It's not even modern Israeli cultural context or Orthodox Judaism cultural context. His culture, his word, as he gave to his people, that is the ultimate cultural context. So to try to say that God is unable to tell us what is okay or not okay because of the cultures of the nations, it's just a bad argument. It doesn't hold water, right? It directly contradicts this entire passage. So if that's your stance, do better. And if you can approach his word humbly and say, you know what, God, I'm coming from a cultural context. I'm coming out of Egypt. I'm coming out of these places that I have some confusion about your word, and I don't understand how these things possibly can be true or possibly can be right or righteous. Then you go back to the words of Yeshua. Yeshua said, and it's in the Apostolic writings of this particular passage as well, that the greatest command is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Elsewhere, he says that on these two hang all the law and the prophets. So going back to exegesis versus eisegesis, if loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself is the foundation, the tent peg, which affixes all the law and the prophets, then when you approach these things to interpret them, try to imagine a version of the law which best loves God and best loves your neighbor. Because any one of us can imagine versions of law which we can abuse to exploit our neighbors, to take advantage of those around us. Or we can be creative and say, okay, how can I do this thing in a way that's going to be beautiful and wonderful? It's like, imagine all the amazing architecture in Europe, right? The cathedrals and the even the old government buildings versus some of the modern, boring, tasteless stuff we have today. Functionally, it's a building, but some buildings are functional and beautiful. Some buildings are functional and depressing and soul-crushing. Are they all buildings? Do they all serve the purpose of a building? Yeah, sure. But in the hands of the person who built them, and in the heart and eyes of the people who designed them, some designed towards beauty, some designed more towards just pure, boring function. And when we approach building our lives and our families and our societies with the Torah, we can imagine building with that beauty of loving God and loving our neighbors ourselves, or we can imagine building those same things with exploitation, with how can I profit off of those around me, whatever the case may be. So it's not inherent to the law how you build. That, I mean, it is technically, right? If, as Yeshua said, all the law and the prophets hang on those two things, then the core spirit of those things is that beauty of loving him and loving your neighbor, rather than all the other horrible things that you can imagine. So when you approach his laws and you're trying to approach them with an exegetical framework, rather than importing all your imaginations of how it could go wrong, except as a, maybe I won't do it that way, try to import an imagination of, okay, how can I walk in this thing in a way that will bless the people around me, in a way that will bring them blessings from God and life and, you know, all the good stuff, right? In a way that shows that I love him, a way that shows that I love those around me. So do not get into that trap of presuming that God is not able to tell us what his culture is. We're not supposed to use the cultures of the nations around us as our foundation stone. that isn't the place. It's him and him alone. And yeah, that's all I've got to say. So, Shabbat Shalom.